The night was heavy with heat, dust, and whispers. Lanterns burned low in the town saloon, their light spilling across warped floorboards and over faces pressed shoulder to shoulder, hungry for spectacle. It wasn't a night for drinking or dancing. Not this time. The tables had been pushed aside, chairs overturned, and the main hall cleared so that a line of men could be marched in under the watch of armed guards. Shackled wrists, iron collars, and the scrape of chains against wood filled the air with a cruel rhythm. Among the crowd sat ranchers, drifters, gamblers, and women in feathered dresses leaning over balconies to catch a glimpse. Some men were thin, beaten down by travel and hard labor. Others were young, restless, with eyes darting toward the exit as if escape might still be possible. Yet none commanded the room's attention more than the giant Apache at the end of the line. He was taller than any man there by a head, his shoulders broad enough to cast shadows even in the dim light. His dark hair fell across his face, and though his wrists bore iron cuffs, his back remained straight. He was a prisoner, but he carried himself like a chief. The auctioneer, a stout man with slicked hair and a booming voice, announced each captive as though selling cattle. "Strong hands, ready for field work," he cried for one. "This one cooks. This one rides." Each man was turned, inspected, tugged at as buyers murmured their bids. But when he reached the end of the line, where the Apache Titan stood silent and unflinching, his tone shifted. "This one here," the auctioneer said, tapping the man's chest with a cane he dared not push too hard. "He's not for the faint-hearted. Wild blood. They say he once led warriors against the army before they burned his village to ash. He hasn't spoken a word since capture. Too dangerous for most folk, but strong enough to break a plow in half if he pleases." The crowd muttered uneasily. Some leaned closer, curiosity sparking in their eyes, but most shook their heads. A man like him was trouble. No amount of muscle was worth the risk of rebellion. It was then that the widow entered. She was not a woman easily ignored. Dressed in a black riding dress, trimmed with silver buttons, she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had survived grief and built a life from its ashes. Her late husband had left her land, cattle, and a reputation, and she had kept them all running, no small feat in a land where men whispered that women should stay behind walls. In this town, when she spoke, men listened. The crowd parted as she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the wood floor. She surveyed the line of captives with a gaze sharp as glass, not rushing, not flinching. The auctioneer bowed slightly and gestured toward the men. "As promised, ma'am, pick one. He belongs to you." Every eye in the room followed her. Some expected her to choose the thin farm hand who might plow fields without complaint. Others thought she might pick the quiet cook who'd never raise his head. A safe choice, a sensible choice. But the widow's gaze drifted past them all until it stopped on the Apache giant. She studied him for a long moment. He met her eyes without lowering his, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them, a recognition perhaps of pride or of pain. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. "Surely not him, ma'am, he's—" Her gloved hand lifted, cutting him off. She pointed directly at the bound Apache. Gasps spread through the room like wind through dry grass. A few men chuckled, others muttered warnings. One voice called, "Out, he'll slit her throat before dawn." Another whispered, "Madness, pure madness." But the widow did not waver. Her finger remained steady, her voice calm yet firm as she said, "That one, he comes with me." The Apache did not move, did not blink, but his eyes burned like embers in the firelight. For the first time that night, his silence carried weight heavier than chains. The auctioneer shifted on his feet, sweat beading his brow. "As you wish, ma'am. But mark my words, he ain't like the others. If you take him, he's your responsibility." The widow merely inclined her head. "Then he belongs to me." And with that, the room erupted in murmurs and disbelief. Some shook their heads at her daring, others admired her courage, but no one would soon forget the sight. A widow with nothing but resolve in her voice and a giant Apache bound in chains, chosen before them all. The auction was over for her. The true story had just begun. The saloon buzzed long after the widow made her choice. Whispers curled like smoke under the low lanterns, each one carrying disbelief. The townsfolk, restless and incredulous, had seen boldness before, but nothing like this. To claim the Apache giant was to court danger, to spit in the face of common sense. Men muttered into their whiskey, women fanned themselves furiously, and the auctioneer dabbed his brow as if he had just seen the devil himself step into the room. The widow did not linger to hear their doubts. Her eyes, steady and unreadable, remained fixed on her selection. The Apache did not flinch when guards tugged the chains that bound his wrists. He moved with deliberate weight, each step echoing against the wooden planks, as though the earth itself acknowledged his presence. Unlike the other captives, he resisted no more than a mountain resists the wind. His silence was not submission, it was defiance. Outside, the night air was cooler but no less charged. The streets of the town brimmed with onlookers who had gathered when word spread that the widow had made her choice. Farmers leaned on wagon rails, ranch hands stood with their hats low, gamblers paused their games in the open-air stalls. All eyes followed as the widow walked ahead, her posture unshaken, while the giant Apache was led behind her under guard. "He'll kill her before she reaches the ranch," a man whispered. "Or she'll tame him," another countered, with a smirk that carried more curiosity than belief. "She doesn't know what she's done," came a third voice, weighted with pity. The widow heard them all, but none of it touched her. She had made her decision, and she would not second-guess herself before a crowd eager for her failure. She stopped at her wagon, its lanterns swinging gently, and turned to face the men who held her new possession. "Load him," she ordered simply. The guards hesitated. One spat to the side. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you sure you want this one? He'll be more trouble than 3 men put together." Her dark eyes locked on his. "If I wanted trouble, I would have picked one of you." The man flushed, red as a few bystanders laughed uneasily. Reluctantly, the guards lifted the chains and guided the Apache toward the wagon. He did not resist, though his gaze never left the widow. It was not the look of a beaten man, nor of one resigned to fate. It was a fire smoldering, waiting, as if measuring the woman who had dared to single him out. He was made to sit in the back, the boards creaking under his massive frame. The guards tied his wrist to the rail, though the widow noticed how little the gesture seemed to matter. Chains could hold his body, yes, but they could not cage the will she saw in his eyes. With the matter settled, she climbed into the driver's seat of the wagon. The guards mounted their horses to ride alongside, still muttering about her foolishness. The crowd began to disperse, though not without glances of disbelief and wagers muttered under breath. Some said she wouldn't last a week, others bet she wouldn't last a day. The wagon creaked into motion, wheels rolling over dust and stone. The night stretched wide, the stars pricking through the velvet dark, and the only sounds were the clop of hooves and the rattle of chains behind her. For a long while, no one spoke. The widow guided the horses with steady hands, her back straight, her face set. But she could feel the weight of his gaze upon her. At last, without turning, she broke the silence. "They think you'll kill me before dawn." The Apache said nothing. She let the quiet settle again, but this time it was not a comfortable silence. It was taut, strung like a bowstring, the kind that could snap with the faintest touch. She tried again. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I've taken a risk too great. But I didn't choose you to prove them wrong. I chose you because—" She trailed off, then shook her head, dismissing her own words. Because I saw something in you they didn't. The chains rattled softly as the Apache shifted his hands, though whether it was discomfort or deliberate, she could not tell. His eyes gleamed faintly in the starlight, unblinking, a flame banked deep within. He remained silent. But silence was an answer in itself. It told her he would not break easily, that he would not bow his head to anyone. Not even her. She breathed, deeply, steadying herself against the strange certainty growing within her chest. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, the whole town would call her mad. But she knew somehow that her choice was not wrong. The wagon carried on into the dark, the widow at the reins, and the Apache Titan chained behind her. A woman who refused to fear, and a man who refused to yield. Two forces set on a path that neither chain nor whisper could undo. The real battle was only just beginning. The wagon rattled along the moonlit trail, leaving the hum of the town behind. The saloon's glow had faded, the voices of doubters and gamblers swallowed by the desert night. Ahead stretched open land, wide, silent, and lonely, broken only by the rustle of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a coyote. The widow sat tall at the reins, her black dress catching the faint silver light, while the guards rode alongside on horseback, rifles propped against their saddles. Behind her, bound to the rail of the wagon, sat the Apache Titan. His silhouette loomed against the star-strewn sky, unmoving, his silence heavier than the chains themselves. Every creak of the wagon and jingle of the bit seemed louder in the emptiness. The widow's horses, strong chestnut mares, strained against. The harness, eager to reach the open road that would lead them home. She flicked the reins gently, urging them forward, though her thoughts were not on the trail but on the figure behind her. What had she truly done? It was one thing to make a bold choice before a crowd, to point her finger and claim the man everyone feared. That moment had been clear, her instincts sharper than the noise around her. But now, in the quiet between town and ranch, she felt the gravity of her decision settle like a stone in her chest. The Apache had not spoken. He had not begged, nor cursed, nor pleaded. The other captives had cast their eyes down, broken by circumstance. But not him. His silence was defiance, and his gaze, she could feel it burning into her back, even when she dared not look. It was not the stare of a beaten man. It was the stare of one who waited. The guards muttered among themselves as they rode. "Crazy woman," one said, spitting into the dirt. "Mark my words, he'll cut her throat the second those chains loosen." The other grunted. "Wouldn't blame him. Man like that doesn't belong behind fences. He's a storm waiting to break." The widow kept her eyes forward. She had heard their doubts all evening, and yet something in her refused to bend. Still, she tightened her grip on the reins, steadying herself. At one point, the wagon hit a rut, and the Apache shifted with the jolt. The chains clinked, and for the briefest moment she glanced back. Their eyes met under the moonlight. His expression did not change. Unreadable, proud, unbroken. But she felt a jolt deep within, as if she were staring not at a prisoner but at a force of nature, untamed and enduring. She broke the gaze first, turning back to the road. Hours stretched long in the silence. The desert night grew colder, the stars sharper overhead. Coyotes howled closer now, their cries echoing off unseen cliffs. The guards' horses snorted nervously, ears twitching at shadows. Finally, one of the guards broke the quiet with a nervous chuckle. "Maybe he's waiting for her to sleep before he makes his move." The other smirked, shaking his head. "If I were him, I'd have snapped her neck back at the saloon. He don't need sleep for that." The widow's jaw tightened. "If either of you are so convinced he's going to kill me," she said sharply, "then why are you riding beside me instead of turning back to town?" The guards fell silent, chastened. The wagon pressed on, the desert stretching wide, until at last the faint outline of her ranch came into view. The fences, the dark silhouettes of cattle penned for the night, and the warm glow of lanterns burning on the porch. A place built on labor, loss, and stubbornness. As they neared, the widow slowed the horses. Something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable. The Apache raised his head slightly, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. He did not look at the ranch with fear or awe, but with the careful watchfulness of a man stepping onto enemy ground. When the wagon finally stopped, the guards moved to untether him. He stood slowly, towering over them, the chains clinking against his wrists. For a moment his eyes swept the ranch, the fences, the barns, the men working in the shadows. Then his gaze returned to the widow. She felt the weight of it, steady and piercing. This was not a man cowed by iron. This was a man who carried his freedom in his very stance, no matter what bound his body. The guards led him toward the barn where he would be kept for the night. The ranch hands, stirred by the sound of the wagon, gathered nearby, their faces filled with unease. Murmurs rose quickly. Some laughed at her foolishness, others whispered warnings. But the widow stood on the porch steps, her shoulders square, her voice carrying clearly into the cool night air. He stays here. He works here. He belongs here now. Gasps and protests rippled. But she silenced them with a look. And all the while, the Apache Titan stood in chains, silent, his eyes locked on hers. Neither bowed, neither blinked. It was the beginning of a battle no one else could understand. Night was restless on the widow's ranch. Lanterns burned longer than usual as ranch hands muttered about the new arrival, the chained Apache, who now sat locked in the barn. No one had seen him eat, drink, or speak since he'd been brought from town. Some called him dangerous. Others said he was broken already, but none dared to go near him. His silence unsettled them more than any outburst could have. The widow watched from her porch as the men gathered in clusters, their whispers carried by the night wind. She knew what they were saying, that she had made a mistake, that she had invited death into her home. But she would not let their fear dictate her choices. At dawn, when the first rays of sunlight spilled across the dry earth, she rose and walked to the barn herself. The air inside was heavy with dust and the scent of hay. There, seated against a post with chains still binding his wrists, was the Apache Titan. His eyes opened slowly when she entered, sharp and alert, though his body had barely moved through the long night. He had not touched the water left for him, nor the bread placed nearby. They remained untouched, deliberate acts of refusal. "You're making a point?" she said quietly, her voice steady as she approached. "You'd rather starve than take food from my hand?" His gaze met hers, unflinching, unreadable. He did not confirm nor deny, but the truth hung between them like smoke. "You think this is another cage," she continued. "Another set of walls meant to keep you where you don't belong." Silence. She took another step closer. The ranch hands who had followed her to the barn's doorway tensed, their hands twitching near their belts. One whispered, "Careful, ma'am, he'll break your neck." But the widow ignored them. She stopped only a few feet from the towering figure, the morning light catching in his dark hair. She had seen men broken by defeat before, their shoulders slumped, their eyes dull. He was not broken. He sat as though his chains were merely an inconvenience, not a sentence. "You've got pride," she said softly. "That much is clear. But pride doesn't mend fences or feed cattle." At this, something flickered in his eyes, not agreement, but perhaps curiosity at her audacity. The widow bent down, picked up the untouched bread, and set it back in front of him. "Eat or don't. That choice is yours, but if you think chains are the measure of your worth, then you've already given up more than you should." Still silence. Frustration rippled through the men at the door. One spat on the ground. "He's mocking you, ma'am." He ain't gonna do nothing but sit there until he rots. The widow straightened, her expression sharpening. She turned to the men. Then let him rot. But I'll not treat him like a broken mule. You hear me? Not one of you lays a hand on him unless I say so. The men grumbled, exchanging doubtful looks, but they obeyed. That night, she returned again, this time alone. The barn was quiet, the cattle settled in the distance. She lit a lantern and placed it on the post near him. Its warm glow painted his features in shifting light, revealing lines of weariness, but also strength, a face carved by hardship, not submission. You can sit in silence as long as you like, she said. But I didn't bring you here to be a ghost. For a moment, she thought he might finally speak. His lips parted as if words lay just beyond them. But instead, he closed his eyes, shutting her out. The widow's hand tightened on the lantern's handle. She felt the sting of frustration, the weight of defiance pressing between them, but she did not lash out, nor did she retreat. You want to test me? She whispered. Fine, then I'll test you. With that, she unlocked the chain at his feet and dropped the key at his side. His wrists remained bound, but the anchor that kept him to the post was gone. Tomorrow, she said, you'll walk the ranch without a chain. You'll work or you'll run. And if you run, the men will hunt you down, same as they would any thief. But if you stay... Her voice softened just slightly. Then maybe you'll prove to me you're more than just silence. She left the barn without another word, the echo of her boots fading into the night. The Apache opened his eyes again, glancing down at the key gleaming faintly in the lantern's glow. He did not move to pick it up. Instead, he sat in stillness, as though weighing not the chains, but the meaning of her gamble. For the first time since his capture, his silence was not defiance alone. It was consideration. The morning sun rose sharp and golden, spilling over the wide plains and cutting across the widow's ranch. Birds lifted from the fence posts, cattle lowed from their pens, and the smell of dust and hay drifted in the warming air. It was a day, like any other for the ranch hands, but today carried an edge of tension so thick it could be felt in every corner. The Apache Titan walked free of the barn. His wrists still bore iron cuffs, but the chain at his ankles was gone. The widow's men watched with narrowed eyes as he stepped into the yard, tall and unshaken, his shadow stretching long against the morning light. Some spat into the dirt, muttering about the danger of letting him roam untethered. Others just watched, waiting for him to bolt, certain he'd run for the hills the moment her back was turned. But he did not run. The widow herself stood on the porch, arms folded, her gaze steady. She gave no order, no command. She simply watched, waiting to see what choice he would make. The ranch hands carried on with their chores, though uneasily. Fences needed mending, troughs needed filling, and the cattle pressed restlessly against their enclosures. Near the corral, a beam had fallen during the storm the night before. A heavy timber split from its post, lying crooked and half-buried in the dirt. 3 men had already tried lifting it, grunting and cursing as sweat rolled down their brows, but it wouldn't budge. It was then that the Apache's gaze settled on the scene. Slowly, without a word, he crossed the yard. The men stiffened, reaching instinctively for the tools at their belts, but he ignored them. He stopped at the beam, studying it with sharp, deliberate eyes. Then, in one fluid motion, he bent and grasped it. The ranch hands smirked at first, expecting him to fail, but their smirks faltered when the giant lifted the timber clean off the ground. His muscles strained, his jaw set, but his movements were steady, controlled. Where 3 men had failed, he carried the weight alone. With careful steps, he positioned the beam back into place, balancing it across the corral posts. The wood thudded into place with a finality that silenced the entire yard. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the cattle seemed hushed. The widow's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. The men muttered, uneasy. Strong as a damn ox, one whispered. Another shook his head. Yeah, but strength ain't the same as loyalty. The Apache ignored them all. He did not look for approval, nor did he acknowledge the stares. His eyes scanned the work around him, as if measuring the land, the fences, the animals, the rhythms of the ranch itself. Then, without being asked, he moved. To the next task. He hauled water to the troughs, lifted feed sacks that weighed more than some of the men, and repaired a gate that had sagged for weeks. The hands exchanged nervous glances. They couldn't deny the man's skill. He worked with the precision of someone who knew the land, who understood the value of labor, and yet there was no humility in his silence. He did not bow his head. He did not show gratitude. Every movement was deliberate, a statement in itself. I do this because I choose to, not because I serve you. By midday, sweat gleamed across his broad shoulders, but his pace never slowed. He paused only once, standing by the edge of the corral, his gaze fixed far beyond the horizon. His eyes lingered on the mountains in the distance, sharp against the sky. For a moment, he seemed apart from them all, a figure untethered, dreaming of another life, one of fire, freedom, and home. The widow saw it. She knew he had not surrendered, not truly. The chains may have loosened, but his spirit remained unbroken, and yet she could not deny the truth stirring inside her. He had chosen not to flee. He had chosen to stay, at least for now. When evening came, the men gathered at the porch, their faces mixed with awe and suspicion. He works harder than 3 of us put together, one admitted reluctantly. Don't mean nothing, another snapped. It's all a trick. Sooner or later he'll turn on us. But the widow's eyes never left the figure in the yard, standing tall against the sunset, his chest rising slow and steady. Or maybe, she said quietly, he's showing us what freedom looks like when a man claims it for himself. Her words silenced them. The men glanced at each other, uncertain. The Apache did not look back at her, nor at the men. He stood with the fading sun painting fire across the sky, silent as ever but no longer invisible. The test was not finished, but its answer had begun to take shape. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm the ranch had never known. At dawn, the Apache rose with the men, moving with the same deliberate strength as before. He lifted, hauled, mended, and carried without complaint, his silence as steady as his hands. By dusk, the fences stood straighter, the cattle calmer, and the barn sturdier than it had in months. Yet his silence lingered like a storm cloud. The ranch hands muttered that he was biding his time, waiting for the moment to strike. Some swore they saw him staring at the horizon at night, his eyes fixed on the far-off mountains, like a wolf dreaming of the pack it had lost. The widow, though, saw something more. One evening, she lingered near the corral as the sun bled across the sky. The men had finished their work and gone to wash up, leaving the yard quiet. She watched the Apache as he filled the last trough. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if every task carried weight beyond labor. You haven't spoken a word, she said at last, stepping closer. He did not turn. He lifted the bucket, poured water, set it down. They say silence is a weapon, she continued, her voice soft but firm. But I think yours is something else, a shield, perhaps. For the first time he glanced at her, just a flicker, but enough to pierce. His eyes held stories she could not yet name. Grief, anger, pride, and a weight so deep it seemed older than either of them. Later that night, unable to shake that look, she asked one of the older ranch hands, a man who had lived long enough to remember wars, treaties, and broken promises. You know of him? She asked. The man nodded slowly. They called him a war captain once. Led his people when the soldiers came. Brave, but it cost him everything. His village burned. family scattered, most killed. Those who survived, he shook his head. They say he never stopped fighting, until they caught him. The widow's chest tightened. She had suspected strength, but not loss of that magnitude. It explained his silence, his refusal to bow. The chains on his wrists were nothing compared to the ashes he carried inside. That night, as the ranch fell quiet, she walked to the barn again. He was there, seated in the shadows, his broad frame hunched just slightly, as though even his strength could not keep the past from pressing down on him. "You lost more than freedom," she said softly. "Didn't you?" The lantern she carried threw light across his face. His jaw tightened, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as though the weight of memory had surged too suddenly. Still, no words came. The widow knelt near him, the lantern between them. "You think silence keeps the ghosts away, but I know better. Ghosts don't care for silence. They follow no matter how far you walk." The chains clinked as he shifted slightly, his chest rising deep and slow. His gaze met hers again, and though he still said nothing, she felt the truth pressing from behind his silence. She leaned back, her voice low. "I don't need your words, but don't think I can't see the fire in you. A man who's lost everything, and still stands? That's not weakness. That's strength most men will never know." For a long moment the barn was still, the only sound the cattle shifting in their stalls. Then softly, almost imperceptibly, the Apache exhaled. Not a sigh, not surrender, but something closer to acknowledgement. It was enough. When she left, she did not feel victory. She felt connection, fragile, tentative, but real. For the first time, she understood that the man before her was not just a captive, nor merely a symbol of danger. He was a survivor. And survivors carried shadows deeper than chains. That night, the widow dreamed of fire, not her own memories, but his, though she had never seen them. Smoke rising from a burning village, children crying, warriors falling. And through it all, the same pair of eyes unbroken, refusing to bow. She woke with the dawn, her chest heavy. The Apache was still silent, but she no longer mistook it for emptiness. It was the silence of a man who had already endured the end of one world and lived to walk through the ashes of it into another. The ranch had settled into its uneasy rhythm. Days of toil rolled into nights of quiet suspicion. The men still watched the Apache Titan with wary eyes, though they could no longer deny his usefulness. He repaired, lifted, hauled, and mended with a skill that shamed half the crew. Yet the silence lingered, a wall between him and them. To the ranch hands, he was a storm waiting to break. To the widow, he was something else, a question yet unanswered. That answer came one night when the storm they feared was not him, but others. It began with the distant thrum of hooves. At first, the men thought it thunder rolling low across the plains, but thunder didn't carry the harsh rhythm of riders closing in. The widow had been on the porch, lantern in hand, when she saw the dust plume under the moonlight. Her stomach dropped. Raiders. She'd heard whispers of them for weeks. Men with no land, no law, feeding on cattle and chaos. And now they had chosen her ranch. "Up! All of you, up!" she shouted, her voice sharp as a rifle crack. The ranch. Hands scrambled, rifles pulled from racks, boots pounding against wooden steps. Cattle bawled in fear as the herd shifted, sensing danger before it fully arrived. The raiders came fast, whooping and firing shots into the air. Their silhouettes cut jagged shapes against the horizon, bandanas pulled across their faces. They aimed for the cattle pens first, the heart of her ranch's livelihood. The widow raised her rifle and fired, the crack splitting the night. One raider reeled back in his saddle, his horse screaming as it bolted. The fight began in earnest. Bullets sang through the dark, Men shouted, horses screamed. The widow's ranch became a battleground. In the chaos, she glimpsed the Apache. He had been unshackled earlier that day to work. Now he stood near the barn, free of tether, unarmed but unflinching. For a heartbeat, she thought this was it. He would vanish into the night, seize his freedom while blood and noise covered his escape. But he didn't run. Instead, he charged. With nothing but raw strength, he ripped a post from the corral fence. The wood splintered, jagged and heavy, but he wielded it like a war club. A raider bore down on him, pistol raised. The Apache swung once, and the man toppled from his horse, the weapon flying useless into the dirt. Another rider turned his gun, on the widow. She felt the air burn past her cheek as the bullet missed, the recoil forcing her back a step. Before the raider could fire again, the Apache was there, the wooden beam slamming into the rider's side, sending both man and horse sprawling. The ranch hands gaped. For all their rifles and bullets, it was the chained man who fought with, the Fury of 10. He moved like a storm-given form, his silence breaking into a roar that shook the night as he swung, grappled, and threw down the men who sought to take what wasn't theirs. The widow reloaded, firing into the fray, but her eyes kept finding him, the giant who had every reason to leave her for dead, yet now stood between her and the raiders as though the land were his own to defend. The fight was fierce but brief. Outnumbered and caught off guard by the resistance, the raiders broke, fleeing into the dark. Hooves thundered away, leaving only dust, groans, and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Silence followed, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The widow lowered her rifle slowly. Her hands shook, though she hit it well. Around her, ranch hands muttered in disbelief. He saved her. Could have run, but didn't. Why in God's name would he fight for us? The Apache stood in the yard, chest heaving, sweat and dust streaking across his face. The broken post still hung in his hand, splintered and bloodied. His eyes met hers across the carnage. No words passed between them. None were needed. He had made a choice. Yet even as gratitude surged in her chest, she saw it clearly. His gaze wasn't softened by loyalty nor warmed by friendship. It was the look of a man who fought not for her, not for her ranch, but because his spirit refused to bow to thieves. He had defended her not as a master, but as another soul standing against the fire of chaos. Still, in the eyes of her men, the lines blurred. The whispers began again, but they sounded different now. Less fear, more awe. The widow's heart pounded as she set her rifle down. For the first time, she wondered, not what he might do to her, but what she might become beside him. The night was theirs, but the bond forged in it was something neither had expected. Morning came heavy after the battle. The ranch scattered, with broken fence posts, spent casings, and blood that stained the earth darker than the dew. The cattle, restless through the night, moved uneasily in the pens, their cries a reminder of how close the ranch had come to ruin. The men walked the grounds with weary eyes, muttering about patching fences, counting heads, and tending wounds. But their voices always circled back to the same subject: the Apache. He had fought like a tempest, turning the tide of the raid. More than one of the ranch hands admitted they would not be alive if not for him. Yet gratitude did not erase years of prejudice, nor the fear of what such a man might still do. "Ma'am," one of the older hands said, removing his hat as he spoke to the widow, "with all due respect, he's dangerous. Maybe last night he fought with us, but that doesn't mean tomorrow he won't fight against us. You saw the fury in him. That kind of strength don't come without a price." Another chimed in. "There's men in town who'd pay for him, pay well. Enough. To cover the repairs, maybe more. After what he's shown, he's worth 10 ordinary workers." The words sank into the widow like stones. Sell him. The thought had crossed her mind before, back when he had been nothing more than a silent presence in chains. But now, after the raid, after watching him stand against men who would have taken her land, her cattle, perhaps even her life. The idea twisted in her chest. She gave no answer, only nodded curtly and walked away, though the men exchanged knowing looks behind her. Later, she found him at the far end of the corral, helping. Man the fence. His hands were raw from labor and battle, but he worked without pause. The great frame of his body moved with purpose, silent as always, though his eyes carried something different now. They were not the eyes of a prisoner staring toward escape. They were the eyes of a man measuring the ground beneath him, as if weighing whether it could be called his own. The widow approached slowly, her steps crunching on the brittle earth. "They think I should sell you," she said, her voice steady though her heart pressed against her ribs. He stopped, straightened, and turned his gaze toward her. The chains that had once bound him still hung loosely from his wrists, broken during the fight, yet he wore them like a grim reminder. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in the knowing way of someone who had heard such bargains made over human lives before. She swallowed hard. "They're not wrong. After what you did last night, they see value in you. And selling you would buy time for this ranch, repairs, feed, protection." Still, he said nothing. The silence pressed on her like a question she couldn't answer. "I should," she admitted, her voice trembling now. "But I can't." The words startled her as much as they seemed to surprise him. She had not meant to speak them aloud, but once they fell into the open air, there was no taking them back. "You could have run," she whispered, stepping closer. "You could have left us to die, but you didn't. And now I see you for what you are, not property, not some prize to be traded. You are—" Her words faltered, her throat tightening. "A man. A man who deserves more than chains." His eyes softened, if only for a heartbeat, before the walls returned. He turned back to his work, shoulders squared against both her gaze and his own ghosts. But the flicker had been enough. The widow's heart wavered between duty and something she dared not name. She knew what her men expected, what the town would say. A widow taking in a captured Apache? Whispers would spread like wildfire and not kindly. She would be judged, scorned, perhaps even ruined. Yet when she pictured selling him, handing him over to men who would break him for profit, her stomach turned. That night, alone in her room, she lit a single candle and stared into the flame. She had fought raiders, storms, and hunger to keep her ranch alive. But this choice felt heavier than all of it. To sell him was to betray what she now knew in her bones. To keep him was to risk everything else. The candle flickered as she whispered into the stillness. "What kind of woman am I if I turn him into a coin purse?" Her reflection in the window gave no answer, but deep down she already knew. The dilemma was no longer about the ranch, the men, or even the raiders. It was about her, and the man she could not bring herself to lose. The days after the raid stretched long and tense. The ranch hands worked to mend the fences, counting their cattle with relief at finding the losses fewer than feared. Every nail driven, every plank lifted was a reminder that survival had come at a cost, and that the greatest debt was owed to the man none of them fully trusted. The widow felt their eyes on her more than usual. Whispers followed her wherever she went. "She's gone soft on him. Can't let feelings get in the way of business. Mark my words, that Apache'll bring nothing but trouble." She ignored them outwardly, but each word stung like a burr under her skin. The men had always questioned her leadership, doubted that a woman could hold a ranch together after her husband's death. Now they found new fuel for their suspicions, yet every time her resolve hardened, she would catch sight of him. The Apache worked tirelessly, often from dawn until after the sun dipped low. He fixed broken corrals, carried timber, and even helped calm the spooked cattle with a steady hand. He spoke little, almost never, but his presence was steady as stone. Sometimes she caught him watching the horizon, as though listening for something distant, a call only he could hear, and against all reason, she found herself drawn to him. It began in small moments. The way his shadow stretched tall in the bright, early morning light, the sound of his steady breath as he worked, the quiet dignity in his silence. She caught herself watching him too long, her chest tightening in ways she had not felt since before her husband's passing. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she found herself carrying a pail of water to where he was mending the barn wall. It was an excuse. He did not need her help, but she needed to be near him. "You should rest," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "You've done more than enough today." He turned, his dark eyes meeting hers, and for the first time she thought she saw warmth there, not fire, not fury, but something gentler, flickering like a hidden ember. He accepted the water, their fingers brushing as the pail passed between them. The touch was brief, but it jolted her heart in a way no bullet ever could. She wanted to say more, to thank him again for the night of the raid, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, silence stretched between them, thick with everything, unspoken. That night, alone in her room, she lay awake long after the candles had burned out. The widow who had buried her husband, who had fought tooth and nail to keep the ranch alive, who had sworn she would never again give her heart. That widow now trembled like a girl at the thought of a man she should have feared, and it terrified her. The days that followed only deepened the conflict. The men grew restless, muttering louder about selling him. One even cornered her outside the bunkhouse, spitting the words with sharpness. "He ain't one of us, ma'am. He never will be. Don't let your heart blind you. You keep him here. It'll cost you the ranch. Maybe even your life." She dismissed the man with a sharp word, but when she turned away, her hands shook. Was it true? Was she letting something dangerous take root in her chest? Yet the heart does not bow to logic. One evening, as she sat alone on the porch, the Apache approached. He stood silently for a long moment, the moonlight catching the hard lines of his face. Then, with slow, deliberate care, he set something down at her feet, a carved piece of wood, smoothed and shaped into the form of a horse. Her breath caught. She bent to pick it up, running her fingers over the grooves where his hands had worked. It was rough, imperfect, but full of intent. A gift. When she looked up, his eyes were on hers, and this time there was no mistaking it. The ember was real. Her heart pounded as though it might burst. In that instant, she knew the truth she had tried to deny. She no longer saw him as a prisoner, nor even as a protector. She saw him as a man, one she was beginning to want in ways she could not explain nor resist. But love in the open plains was never simple, and as the whispers of affection grew louder in her heart, so too did the dangers that threatened to tear them both apart. The gift sat on her nightstand, the carved wooden horse catching the glow of the lantern's flame. She had turned it over, in her hands again and again, memorizing every imperfect groove. It was more than a token. It was a bridge, from silence to understanding, from chains to freedom, from fear to something far deeper. But the world outside her room was not blind. By the week's end, the whispers had turned into demands. The ranch hands cornered her after supper, their faces set in grim determination. "Ma'am," the eldest said, his voice low but firm, "we've stood by you since your husband passed. We've worked this land with you, bled for it. But this, keeping him here, treating him like one of us, it's madness." Another spat on the ground. "We all saw how you look at him. Folks in town are already talking. Do you want to ruin the name your husband built?" The words stung, but worse was the truth behind them. Her feelings were no longer hidden. "If you won't sell him," the first man pressed, "then we'll leave. You can't run this ranch without us." The air between them thickened with finality. They were forcing her hand. That night, she sat on the porch, staring at the stars that stretched endless across the sky. She had always been strong, always chosen survival over sentiment. But for the first time, she felt herself split in two. Inside, the wooden horse waited, a quiet reminder of what her heart had already decided. Her thoughts were broken by footsteps. The Apache stood at the edge of the porch, the moonlight wrapping him in silver. He carried no weapon, no chains, only the calm weight of a man who knew storms better than most. "They want me gone," he said at last, his voice deep, measured, and quiet. It was the first time she had heard him speak in more than fragments. She swallowed hard. "Yes, they are not wrong," he added, eyes fixed on the horizon. "My presence brings danger. For you. For your land." "Then why didn't you leave the night of the raid?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. "You could have, you should have, but you stayed." He turned his gaze to her, steady and unwavering. "Because you saw me." Her breath caught. Not as a prisoner, not as a beast in chains. She had seen him as a man, and in that recognition, something had bound them more tightly than iron ever could. Silence hung between them, thick and fragile. The widow's heart thudded against her ribs, every beat screaming what her lips dared not say. She wanted him to stay, not as a worker, not as a protector, but as something she had not allowed herself to want since death had taken her husband. A partner, a man who made her feel alive again, but wanting him meant risking everything else. At dawn, the decision came. The men gathered, expecting her to lead the Apache into town, to sell him off and silence the whispers. Instead, she stood tall on the porch, her voice ringing with the steel that had carried her through storms and fire. "He stays." The words rippled like a shot across the yard. Faces hardened. Hats came off in disbelief. A few men cursed under their breath. "If you walk," she told them, her eyes fierce, "then walk. I've kept this ranch alive before, and I'll do it again. But I won't trade a man's life for a few dollars or for your comfort." The men shifted, some angry, some ashamed, none daring to meet her eyes. One by one, a few drifted away, muttering. Others stayed, their loyalty tested but not broken. When the dust settled, she turned to him. The Apache stood at the edge of the corral, the faintest glimmer of something, respect, gratitude, perhaps even affection, in his eyes. It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but it was enough. That night, as the prairie winds whispered through, "The grass." She placed the carved horse back on her nightstand, not as a secret but as a promise. The world would talk. The men might leave. The dangers of the plains would not vanish, but for the first time in years, the widow felt no loneliness pressing on her heart. Instead, she felt the weight of choice, her choice, and the quiet strength of the man who had given her more than survival. He had given her something she thought she'd lost forever: hope.